Established in 2006, the series honors Gay Hart Gaines, the 18th regent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Gay and her husband Stanley are with us this evening. Many of you know Gay well, but Gay, I'd like to ask you to stand and be recognized for. They told me when I took the job that when you became emerita, you might not hear from somebody, but I will say Gay is still calling me with great ideas, and I can still barely keep up with her. So I'm grateful for all you've done, Gay. The Gay Hart Gaines lecture series was funded by Gay's dear friend Lou Lerman. Lou deserves double accolades this evening because he's the one who tipped me to Flora Fraser's compelling book of scholarship on George and Martha Washington. Lou is also a great guardian of American history. Having co-founded the Gilder Lerman Institute for American History, Lou and his lovely wife Louise are here, and we are glad to have you both back. So they travel, everyone should know they come all the way down from near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania to do this, and so we're just really glad you're here. Thank you very much. It's also a really great pleasure to introduce Stephen Bromwell. Stephen is the winner, I guess he still is, the winner of the 2013 George Washington Book Prize for his work, George Washington, Gentleman Warrior. We acknowledge also Gilder Lerman as our partners, along with Washington College, in establishing the Washington Book Prize, which Stephen won 3 years ago. And actually, I would say for Lou's benefit that it was really the first very specific book on Washington to win the prize. So, Stephen, we're delighted you're here. Thank you for being here. Tonight marks another milestone in Mount Vernon's renewed efforts to educate the world about Martha Washington and the critical role she played as partner to her beloved George Washington. Earlier this year, we expanded our partnership with the Washington Papers Project at the University of Virginia to undertake a comprehensive edition of Martha Washington's papers in both letterpress and digital format. In March of next year, we will welcome Susan Swain and Richard Norton Smith to discuss their new book on First Ladies as part of the Martha Washington Lecture Series. We continue to add new content about Martha Washington to the Mount Vernon website, and we acknowledge the charm, grace, and wisdom of Mary Wiseman, our own very, very special Martha Washington, who delights and educates visitors here on the estate. It is impossible, as we will learn tonight, to fully know George Washington and understand him and Mount Vernon without knowing the story of Martha Washington. In 1816, John Adams posed this question: would Washington have ever been commander of the Revolutionary Army or president of the United States if he had not married the rich widow of Mr. Custis? So, as you know, ever jealous of the deep affection shown by the American people to Washington in both life and death, he frequently cited Washington's stature, his rugged good looks, and his luck in marriage as evidence that that's all that took him to where he got to. So in her book, Flora Fraser turns Adams' rather derisive question on its ear and makes a cogent argument that, in fact, Washington's marriage to Martha completed him. Her conclusion is, and I quote, that Martha imbued George not only with wealth, but with a confidence he had earlier lacked. Together, this couple, loyal British subjects when they married in 1759, became disaffected with rule from London, and with remarkable consequences for their union as much as for the future of the United States. Flora Fraser faced a daunting task in developing the intricacies of the marriage between George and Martha without the benefit of virtually all of the correspondence between the two of them, and yet she succeeds admirably. Our speaker grew up in London and Scotland, studied classics at Oxford University before becoming a professional writer, the daughter of best-selling biographer Lady Antonia Fraser and the renowned playwright Harold Pinter. She is also the author of, among others, Princesses, The Six Daughters of George III, Beloved Emma, The Life of Emma, Lady Hamilton, and finally, Pauline Bonaparte, Venus of Empire. During her teens and 20s, Ms. Fraser conducted research for a number of authors, including both her grandmother, Elizabeth Longford, and her mother, Antonia Fraser, who were both historical biographers. In 2002, Flora co-founded the Elizabeth Longford Prize for Historical Biography, which she chairs, as well as the Elizabeth Longford Grants for Historical Biography, administered by the Society of Authors. Flora served as a trustee of the London National Portrait Gallery from 1999 to 2008. Since 2011, she has been a member of the Development Council at Wadham College, Oxford. She is also a patron of freeopenairtheatre.org, a company that showcases Greek drama at the Scoop. So the Scoop, I had to look on the web to figure out what. The Scoop is an outdoor amphitheater located near Tower Bridge. She currently resides in London, and we're especially grateful to you to have traveled this far to be with us. So join me in welcoming Flora Fraser.
Thank you, Kurt. Kurt, Gay, Lou, it is, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege and a pleasure to be speaking here this evening at Mount Vernon. I've had the most glorious day walking around the mansion and grounds, and I have put on the as background to this talk just this image which most of you will know. It's a watercolour by Birch, and I was sitting on the piazza on a rocking chair this morning, and I was looking at the beautiful view kept pristine of Maryland opposite by thanks to the Mount Vernon organisation. And to my left I looked, and there indeed was a field of horses. So this is just a small tribute to the work of Mount Vernon in both preserving and reinterpreting George and Martha's home in ever new and surprising ways. I find the story of George and Martha's marriage so engrossing, vital to his success as a commander and president. I would happily narrate all 40 years of it, but we don't have time for that. And I'd like to save some time at the end of my remarks for any questions you'd like to ask me about anything you like. Where did I get this nice coat? Well, as Kurt said, Martha didn't only bring wealth. She was a rich widow, and she brought, I think, confidence to George. He was nervous, easily cast down, and he responded to her natural robustness, and his spirits were shored up right from the beginning of their marriage. Over 15 years of marriage at Mount Vernon before the war, they forged bonds of devotion. Martha journeyed to George at headquarters every winter of the war. At Valley Forge and in Bleak headquarters in New York and New Jersey, she was there for him and he for her. And in the presidency, again, they forged those roles of president and presidential partner together. This, above all, my book, their marriage, and the story of the Washingtons, wherever they are, at Mount Vernon, in the war, in the different presidential homes. It's a story about human connection. It's a shifting union. They start by being colonial conservatives. they become radicalized, swept to the helm of the rebellion, and then take charge in government. And I could talk about any one of those periods, and in my book I do divide these periods into three books. There's book one, book two, and book three, and I like that old-fashioned way of dividing a book. And I want to talk tonight about the third chapter of their lives, the period that they spent as president and presidential spouse, but remembering that all the time this was what they wanted to get back to. And when there was a congressional recess, they came home with joy and went back to the life of duty with, if not regret, with a wish to come back home again. Washington had looked forward to a life of retirement at Mount Vernon when the Revolutionary War ended in 1783. He was just over 50, Martha 8 months older than him. He was 51 and Martha was 52, to be exact. But hopes of a quiet old age eroded during the 5 years after the war, while the Constitution was being framed. Word came in March 1789 of Washington's election as first President of the United States, and he wrote to General Henry Knox, soon to be Secretary of War, "My movements to the chair of government will be accompanied with feelings not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of his execution." George moved swiftly, quitting Mount Vernon within 2 days of the news of his election. His destination was a house in New York on Cherry Street, located close to today's Brooklyn Bridge. It was rented by Congress for a year to serve as a first presidential residence. Here at Mount Vernon, Martha was far from pleased at her husband's elevation, and she wrote to a nephew, "When or whether he will ever come home again, God only knows. I think it was much too late for him to go into public life again, but it was not to be avoided." She added, "Our family will be deranged, as I must soon follow him." In New York, the household was pretty much in need of Martha. You can imagine that Washington and Tobias Lear, his secretary, although both of them were very efficient, they were both missing Martha's capable and cheerful presence. And Lear wrote a chatty letter to George Augustine Washington, Washington's nephew, who was living here. And Lear said, "We've engaged Black Sam Francis, the tavern keeper, as steward and superintendent of the kitchen." In the dining room, Lear added, "Oysters and lobsters make a very conspicuous figure upon the table and never go off untouched. Tell Madam Washington this." Lear hoped this report would have some effect, as she is remarkably fond of these fish. And he hoped she would come hasten to the city. He said, "We are extremely desirous of seeing her here." Washington, meanwhile, was canvassing political colleagues, soon to form an official cabinet. He wanted their opinion on what he called the etiquette proper to be observed by the president. Alexander Hamilton, soon to be Secretary of the Treasury, was firm on May the 5th. He wrote, "The President to accept no invitations and to give formal entertainments only twice or four times a year on the anniversaries of important events in the Revolution." Washington, having digested Hamilton's answers, asked John Adams, newly Vice President, if his appearance rarely at tea parties might be permissible. Perhaps George contemplated sociable Martha's reaction to the confined life sketched out. Adams had no taste for frivolities himself and replied, as the president, he should have no intercourse with society but upon public business or at his levees. The term levee had, to say the least, unfortunate connotations. It derives, of course, from French court ritual and denotes a formal reception following the king rising from his bed. Allusions to levees, whether in colonial days or in revolutionary America, had always been satirical, and now the levee had come to New York. But the new republic was in so many ways a matter of experiment. Argument raged in Congress about the correct form of address for the president. John Adams considered a royal or princely title necessary to uphold the president's authority. His Highness and Excellency were suggestions. The anti-federalist Senator William Maclay, on the other hand, fulminated, "A court our house seems determined on, and to run into all the fooleries, fopperies, fineries, and pomp of court etiquette, and all this for Mr. Adams." Ultimately, Congress decreed on May the 14th, 1789, that Washington should bear the unadorned title, the President, and Mrs. Washington, who had in the war often been known as Lady Washington, became very firmly Mrs. Washington. Towards the end of May, Martha set out for New York. She took with her her two grandchildren, Nellie Park Custis, aged 10, and Wash, or George Washington Park Custis, aged 8. As you all know far better than I, they were the children of her son, Jackie, who had died of camp fever or typhus shortly after victory at Yorktown. And the Washingtons, ever since his death, had given a home to these these two, who were the youngest two of his 4 children. Bob Lewis, one of the president's many nephews, recorded Martha's departure from Mount Vernon. "The servants of the house and a number of the field negroes made their appearance to take leave of their mistress. Numbers of these poor wretches seemed greatly agitated, much affected, my aunt equally so." When the party stopped at Abingdon, the plantation where Martha's elder granddaughters lived, the commotion was still greater. Bob Lewis wrote, "The family in tears, the children are bawling, everything in the most lamentable situation." The new president came over to the Jersey shore to meet his wife and conduct her party to their new home in Manhattan. The Washingtons had always prized the hours they spent alone together. Now at Cherry Street, they took breakfast in private with Nellie and Wash, and with only one servant, not in livery, in attendance, until dinner at 4, luncheon not them being a meal taken. Washington worked with his secretaries, always in conference with cabinet colleagues. Martha supervised her grandchildren, oversaw the running of the household, and often went shopping. Additionally, she kept up a detailed correspondence with her niece, Fanny Bassett Washington, wife to George Augustine here at Mount Vernon. George Augustine was in charge of the plantation and Fanny in charge of the house. Martha described her new life to Fanny in mid-June. Since she arrived in New York, she wrote, I have not had 1/2 hour to myself. Her hair was set and dressed every day, and she wore white muslin summer dresses. She told her niece, you would, I fear, think me a good deal in the fashion if you could but see me. Nellie Park Custis was loving the city, her grandmother reported. She is a little wild creature and spends her time at the window looking at carriages, etc., passing by, which is new to her. As you think of the carriages coming up to Mount Vernon, not this constant traffic in the metropolis of New York. Martha noted that her granddaughter was to begin music the following week, and entrance money was paid to composer Alexander Reinagle to teach Nellie the pianoforte. She became a fine performer. At Mrs. Graham's School for Young Ladies in Maiden Lane, Nellie was also a conscientious student. 8-year-old Wash, dark as his sister was fair, had charm and high spirits, but no powers of application. The president's ambition to make of him a scholar were doomed. With the sons of Alexander Hamilton and Henry Knox, Wash attended Patrick Murdoch's school on Greenwich Street, but without enthusiasm. He much preferred life at home, where he was thoroughly spoiled by his grandmother and all the servants. For the Washingtons, the levee, the drawing room, and the Congress dinner shaped the week. The Tuesday levee at Cherry Street was strictly for gentlemen and occupied an hour from 3 to 4 in the afternoon. Washington, the host, was a majestic figure at these assemblies. His great height and powerful build marked him out, and his habit of silence was unnerving. He appeared still more regal when he adopted a suit of black velvet following his mother's death in August 1789. And the Lansdowne portrait is of Washington in that black velvet coat against the costly gold and crimson background. He's as splendid as any European monarch, but he is the president, regardless of what the anti-federalists threw at him. When not on parade, Washington wore for undress or everyday dress what a visiting godson described as pepper and salt clothes, a sort of cloth tweed. Martha hosted the Friday reception, known as the drawing room. Husbands brought their wives and daughters, who curtsied to Mrs. Washington before circulating and enjoying lemonade and ice cream. The president wore no sword at the drawing room, nor did he carry a hat, which signified that he was a guest at his wife's gathering. But Catty Green, widow of General Nathaniel Greene, described the aura that surrounded Washington. No person presumes to sit in his presence, and he is treated in most respects as if he had a crown. There was some public mockery of Martha's queenly drawing rooms. Queen Charlotte hosted such weekly entertainments in London, but they never attracted such obloquy as would in time the Tuesday levee. Abigail Adams wrote on first meeting Martha this August that there was not the least tincture of hauteur or pride about the president's wife, and a further visit compounded Mrs. Adams' respect. A most becoming pleasantness sits upon her countenance, and an unaffected deportment. I found myself much more deeply impressed than I ever did before their Majesties of Britain. John Adams had, of course, earlier been American minister at the court of St. James. Abigail praises Martha's white hair, her beautiful teeth, her plain but costly clothes. Martha was careful in public to present herself as bland and benign. In private, she spoke her mind, whether condemning Jefferson for ill treatment of her husband, or weighing in with advice to family members. When Fanny Washington reported that one of her children here was unwell, Martha replied, "Children that eat everything as they like and feed as heartily as yours does must be full of worms. Indeed, my dear Fanny, I never saw children stuffed as yours was when I was down in Virginia." Every Thursday, the Washingtons hosted at Cherry Street a public dinner, which became known as the Congress Dinner. And I first became interested by this Congress Dinner when I saw in the Taubman room in the museum here the beautiful display of the Sèvres and the Angoulême biscuit and the decorations, the table ornaments. And so it gave me huge pleasure to write about the Congress dinners in my book. But it wasn't until I was back in the museum today that I suddenly realized that's where my whole idea about the Congress dinner came from. It's such a remarkably potent display. I'm sure all of you know it well. And so members of Congress were invited, and their wives too. Some politicians had bitter memories of profligate dinners hosted by congressional presidents during the war. They called on the new US president to renounce this style of entertainment. Washington refused. He told a friend in Virginia, first, the novelty of it would, I well knew, be considered as an ostentatious imitation or mimicry of royalty in England. King George III dined always in private with Queen Charlotte. And secondly, he continued, so great a seclusion would stop the avenues to useful information from the many and make me dependent on the few in whose vortex I moved. And so the Thursday Congress dinner continued. George and Martha administered Mount Vernon while they were in New York and later while they were in Philadelphia, mostly by remote control, that is, by correspondence with George Augustine and Fanny. But the young couple proved reluctant to exercise authority over servants, house slaves, field slaves. Letters of admonishment from the president and Mrs. Washington from New York had little effect. Martha wrote to her niece about Charlotte, an experienced slave seamstress. She is so indolent that she will do nothing but what she is told. She knows what work is to be done. And George was equally fretful about the estate and the work being done and being overseen by George Augustine. It was a sacrifice that they didn't hesitate to make, for Washington to become the servant of Congress again. But it was a sacrifice for a couple in their late 50s and going into their 60s not to be here overseeing the estate and home they cared so very much about. Martha reproached Fanny too for prodigal hospitality. It never was the president's, intention to give wine or go to any expense to entertain people that come to Mount Vernon out of curiosity. Rum may always be had. The Washingtons had brought some house slaves from Mount Vernon. Many of the domestics, however, at Cherry Street were white servants hired in the city. And Washington's secretary, Lear, commented that they were all impressed with an idea that they are the best servants that can be obtained. This was decidedly not the Washingtons' view. When a new steward, John Hyde, replaced Black Sam Francis, the president declared, "I strongly suspect that nothing is brought to my table of liquors, fruits, or other things that is not used as profusely at his." Both the Washingtons looked forward to congressional recesses when they decamped for home and could live as private individuals for a time. In New York, George did enjoy a measure of private enjoyment, oddly enough, at the theatre. When he showed himself in the presidential box, he was met with acclamations, cheers, just as George III or any monarch in their capital was met with cheers. The odd boo, actually, I have to be honest, at the theatres of London. During the course of the play, however, within the privacy of his box, Washington could relax with guests, and these were often with their wives, old friends from the war, and now in government, the Hamiltons, the Knoxes, the Schuylers, Robert Morris and Mary. But it was an isolated life they were living, and one very contrary to the hospitable, sociable Virginia way of life that they were used to. Even headquarters in the war had been more sociable than their life in the presidential mansions of New York and Philadelphia. Martha sometimes chafed against the restrictions of her position. She wrote in October 1789 to Fanny, when the president was away on a tour, "I never go to any public place. Indeed, I think I am more like a state prisoner than anything else. There is certain bounds set for me which I must not depart from." But she was usually more philosophical. She told a friend from wartime days a few months later that she was not dissatisfied with her elevated situation. "No, God forbid, for everybody and everything conspire to make me as contented as possible in it." In New York and elsewhere, Washington's birthday in February 1790 was made the occasion of celebration, and every year after that, his birthday was, or birth night as it was called, was marked. In America, before the Revolution, of course, June the 4th, George III's birthday, had been the most important day in the secular calendar. And Jefferson, Secretary of State Jefferson, was later to growl, "Levees, birthdays, drawing rooms." Washington obviously intended to introduce these trappings of the English court with the aim of ultimately of establishing a constitutional monarchy. In fact, month by month, Washington, with Martha's help, was stamping authority on the office of president. Protocol and etiquette was being established with these levees, drawing rooms, dinners, and criticism of the executive branch dimmed in many quarters. In late February 1790, the Washingtons took up residence in a new presidential home leased by Congress. This was a large house on Broadway, close to Bowling Green, that the French ambassador had previously rented. And the Comte de Moustier, this diplomat, had left all furnishings to be sold following his departure for Europe. Congress, on Washington's advice, purchased wonderful suites of sofas and chairs upholstered in green silk, full-length mirrors and other costly items for the reception rooms. And Washington himself bought the 309-piece Sevres dinner service, which is, as is on display, not all 309 pieces, but as the information says in the Taubman room here in the museum, the first dinner was to the senators, and it was used thereafter, and he eventually brought it back here. Easier in office now, Washington had less compunction about displays of grandeur when he judged them fitting. And a senator who came to the Congress dinner in the new residence described the feast to which they sat down. Soup, fish, meats, gammon and fowls preceded mouth-watering desserts. Apple pies, pudding, then iced creams, jellies, then watermelons, muskmelons, apples, peaches, nuts. In Virginia, the Washingtons, as colonial landed gentry, as Commonwealth citizens, had always been generous hosts. Given the scale of their entertaining in New York and in Philadelphia later, it's fortunate Washington accepted the government salary of $25,000 a year. For a few days in May 1790, at the house on Broadway, Washington's life and the security of the fledgling United States hung in the balance. Influenza was raging in New York, and on May the 10th, the president was laid low. He battled to breathe, his lungs were severely inflamed, and doctors came from Philadelphia, as well as New York medics who were called into the case. His condition worsened and became acute, and on the 15th, a caller at the mansion on Broadway found the household in tears and the president's life despaired of. It was an extraordinary moment in the history of the young republic. If Washington died, would Adams, who had no glorious war record and no gift as yet for conciliating cabinet colleagues, fail as president? The very Constitution had been written in the expectation that Washington would serve for some years as president. But George Washington had, as you all know, a very strong physique. And the same day that his life was despaired of, he began to perspire copiously, and then his breathing eased, and within days he was declared safe. A proper recovery would take time, but tranquility was restored to the state. 2 months later, it was Washington, fully recovered, who signed the Residence Act, creating the federal district to accommodate the new capital, the national capital, which one day would be named Washington in the District of Columbia. And two of Martha's granddaughters would settle there, and the Washingtons would visit, but that all lay in the future. For now, the federal government would have its home in Philadelphia, and Congress rented a very fine mansion on Market Street in Philadelphia, belonging to financier Robert Morris. The anti-federalists remained keen to limit governmental pomp and splendour. In 1793, responding to reports of Jacobins seizing power in France, they attacked with renewed fervour Washington's presidential style. Monarchical prettinesses, if that's possible, prettinesses, such as stately nods instead of shaking hands, titles of office, seclusion from the people, etc. But Washington didn't alter by a jot the stately gatherings over which he and Martha presided. They received the envoys of foreign monarchs, as well as those of foreign republics, in a style that they believed upheld the dignity of the United States. Nor did he call a halt to the celebrations on his birthnight. In 1796, 1,000 people gathered at a ball in Philadelphia to celebrate the February anniversary. During Washington's second term, politicians who approved of the revolutionary program in France criticised a treaty negotiated by Chief Justice John Jay with Britain. They claimed it grossly favoured British interests, and Washington, closely associated with the negotiations, was abused as the Senate vote on the treaty neared. Though it was enacted and protest ebbed, the public attacks had made Washington miserable. In March 1796, John Adams wrote, "The turpitude of the American Jacobins touches him more nearly than he owns in words." And a year later, shortly before his second term ended, the president told a dinner partner in Philadelphia that he was like a child within view of the holidays. "I have counted the months, then the weeks, and I now reckon the days previous to my release." John and Abigail Adams became the new occupants of the presidential residence on Market Street. Mrs. Adams acknowledged, to be the successor of Mrs. Washington and to make good her place will be an arduous task. And she wrote a note to Mrs. Washington asking for guidance. "I will endeavour to follow your steps." Martha, for so long a punctilious presidential spouse, was content to withdraw with her husband, so very long a servant of Congress, from the public gaze. "The curtain is falling," she wrote to Catty Green in Georgia, and she looked forward to a more tranquil theatre at home in Virginia. As I'm sure you know, the life of retirement to which the Washingtons had looked forward did not last long before Washington and then Martha passed away. With their deaths, the closeness of their marriage faded from the memories of patriots keen to honour the father of the nation with wreaths and monuments and statuary. I would love it if my book served to bring Martha out of the shadows and restore her to the side of her fascinating, strong but frail, confident but doubting husband, George. Thank you. And I'd be delighted if anyone had any questions to try and answer them.
So where did you get that coat?
I'm very glad you asked me that. I got it from a shop close to me in London called Paul Smith, and I absolutely love it, and I call it my author coat. And I have a secret that when I'm writing, I write more or less in pajamas, and so it's very nice to go out every 4 or 5 years and speak about my books and put on my author coat. Yes.
What made you decide to write about
It was what made me decide to write about Martha Washington. It was coming here. I love sightseeing. I was in DC talking about an earlier book, Princesses, the Daughters of George III. And I came out to visit, as so many do, Mount Vernon. And I came and I went into the mansion, I looked at the house, and I thought, this is so English. And then I looked around at the streams of American school children, and I said, don't be so ridiculous. And also, this is, the American couple, the American couple. But the thought persisted, and I kept thinking about it, and then I thought, well, they were British to start off with, and indeed when they when they furnished the home or embellished the house with Martha's wealth, they were a British colonial couple. But it was that journey, and the fact that Martha was as keen a patriot as George in the war. You read her letters to friends from winter headquarters, and she's, thrilled that Burgoyne's been defeated, and she wishes that blackguard Howe would, same with the hit. She's terrific, and so I think it was the two of them, and it was this idea that they were together all the way through, that they and also that they worked at their marriage, if you like. They made compromises, and I was fascinated to but it did take it sort of, I had to think. It is not only biting off quite a lot to write about George Washington if you are a Brit, but it is also a bit of a cheek, to which I think is not an American expression, but I think it's a bit cheeky. It's more than a bit cheeky, it's very cheeky. But with British understatement, I say it's a bit of a cheek as a Brit to write about George and Martha. But all I can say is I enjoyed every inch of the way, researching here at Mount Vernon, going to the Virginia Historical Society to look at the Park Custis papers, and of course going to all the wonderful national parks, the winter headquarters, and the I love a battlefield, so I went to all the battlefields too. I was brought up on British battlefields, so yes.
In the 15 years that preceded the war, they seemed to be fiercely loyal to each other and to their families. Was it a series of very small events or a cataclysmic event that broke their loyalty to their British citizenship?
It was a series of it was really the Stamp Act that started it, but even before that, they were never happy with the service done them by the firms in London. They were always, as were most Virginians, worried that they weren't getting the right price for the tobacco. They were always, I would imagine, with some justice, complaining that the goods sent to them were a variety of things that didn't work. If they were clothes, they were last year's fashion. In other words, they thought they were being palmed off with shoddy goods, effectively. And so there was always that. And Washington made the decision here to, grow wheat for the domestic market. But there, so I would say it was small, small and incremental. He didn't want to, it was almost like the violence was not something he wanted to resort to early, and but if he had to, he would, and he did, and that is how the conversations go in his letters. And he had George Mason as his next door neighbour, who was such. For me, George Mason is such a fascinating founding father, and to have George Washington here and George Mason next door, and not only were they grafting each other's trees, but they were having these conversations about what legislation to try and get through in Williamsburg or later in Philadelphia. I think it was a very productive relationship between the two Georges on the Potomac.
You very deliberately did not call Martha the First Lady. Do you know when that became used for the president's wife?
It was used only after her death, about she was called the First Lady of the Nation, and I am having my brain is cheese because I've just written a piece. Well, I've never done one before, but I think it's what they call a blog. Anyway, it's on the. It's. I felt very strongly about this, and so I wrote, and it's on the Huffington Post website, and it just went up a couple of days ago, and I'm thinking it was said about Dolly Madison. Does anyone know if that's true? It is. Okay. Phew. So it was Dolly Madison after her death. She was named in an obituary piece. No, I think it was a book about her, the First Lady of the Nation, and it had never been used during her lifetime. In my HuffPost blog, I suggest that it would be a nice nod towards the first president's spouse to refer to the next the next supporter of the next president as the presidential partner, as Martha Washington was called by Washington, an agreeable partner and then consort for life. And after her death, of course, was called a worthy partner for Mr. Washington. I feel presidential partner covers all possible sexes of and it works, because if you have a presidential partner who by chance has been a president himself, that's fine, because you just say the president and Mr. President. Or Mrs. President should. I like the idea. I mean, I also love the term First Lady, and I adore the Smithsonian display of First Ladies' gowns, not least this Mrs. Obama's white dress, which I thought was absolutely fabulous. But maybe it's time for a new room. There might be white tie and tails as well as gowns, or not. Yes.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to reading your book.
Oh, thank you so much.
I don't know if I really need this. My voice carries pretty well. Certainly, I know that Martha Washington traveled to different camps during the war and spent months on
Yes.
the road with George Washington. And if that's not love, I don't know what is. We're Marriott, or I'm a Marriott person myself. But I understand that in the very beginning, before they met, he actually was in love with someone else. And I don't imagine that when they met, it was lightning bolts out of the blue and, an instant love match. Could you talk about the development of their relationship?
Absolutely. And I was just talking with Doug this afternoon about their marriage. It was a small society, Virginia, in the 18th century. Williamsburg was the town where everyone was going to meet at the governor's ball. If they hadn't met, which you can't know whether they had met or not, George and Martha, but certainly when Martha became available as a wealthy widow, they had friends and professional acquaintances in common, and one of them was Robert Carter Nicholas, who was the Park Custis lawyer and also did some legal work for George. And his wife was sister to Sally Fairfax, Mrs. Fairfax, with whom Washington was in love, and in love minutes before he proposed to Martha too. And so it was a very suitable marriage for both of them. Martha needed someone to look after the Park Custis estates. She needed a guardian for her children. She did, I must say, do a very capable job for the year that she was a widow and handled business with and handled businessmen in London with some asperity, which is impressive. Nevertheless, a marriage, she's young, and was almost inevitable. And Washington, I would say, started rational, not cool, but let's say tepid compared to how he felt about Martha later. And there were strains on that marriage. They had no children. That is tough. And we don't have the correspondence. It may well be that they never made reference to it in letters to each other. Martha destroyed their correspondence. But their affection and almost the romantic nature of their relationship only grew as they got older. I can't pinpoint when it is, but I would say that Washington's respect for Martha grew enormously during the war, and he realized during the war, during those months that he was without her in the campaigning season of those 8 years, just how much he missed her. He thought at the beginning of the war that she would be lonely, and he wrote her that wonderful letter. But it's a letter which is here in the library. He wrote from Philadelphia, about to go and take command at Cambridge. But he was worried that she would be lonely, and he was worried that he would be worrying about her being lonely. Or, as it turned out, he was lonely, and they never thought at the beginning of the war that she would be going to him, but it was he who sent for her. And I think the war changed their relationship, as wars do change relationships. But I think that was when he really realized, and that was when he said during the war, he said to Benjamin Franklin's daughter, Mrs. Bache, I pronounced it Batch earlier, I'm not sure which is right. He said, dancing at a ball during the war, he said, I've been, today, it was 12th night, it was Epiphany, January the 6th, and he said, this is the day 20 years ago I was married to Mrs. Washington. And much later, he told Martha's wayward granddaughter, Eliza Custis, who I rather love, he said to her that marriage is the foundation, the most important foundation of life. And it was his marriage to Martha that made him think that. I don't think, marriage is the most important foundation of everyone's lives, but for Washington, I do think it was, that he was married to the right person. Yeah. If she did, she burnt it, unfortunately. But we do have her letters. I find her letters extremely vivid. And as Doug said, the Martha Washington Papers project is underway. And there's, who knows where there may not be Martha Washington letters that were not published in the edition of her papers by Joseph Fields. It's going to be very exciting over the next 4 or 5 years. I think it will go online and be published as well in about 4 years. So I have to say, it's one of the few times that I'm looking forward to revising my book, because then I can read all the new letters that I hope will come out. Because, America's a treasure trove of 18th century papers in the different historical societies. And people travel so much in America, like Martha's great-granddaughters her papers are in Louisiana. And so it's hopefully everyone's going to come forward with new Martha letters, which would be exciting. And there might be a diary. That would be too exciting for words.
So, Flora, thank you very much. You will all be delighted to know that Flora Fraser will be outside to sign books. I invite you all out for a cocktail reception, and I want to thank you all for being here. So thank you very much. Thank you.